The world still believes that poverty is handed down, that some are simply born into lack, others into plenty, and the difference is a matter of fortune no one controls. We inherit this belief before we can question it. We watch it confirmed in the language of bad luck, in the quiet resignation of those who say, "That's just how it is for people like us." And so we spend our lives treating scarcity as weather, something to endure, never something to explain. And yet the truth, the one almost no one stops long enough to consider, is this: lack has never been a condition. It has been a habit, so old and so repeated that it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a fact. Toward the end of the 19th century, a quiet Englishman named James Allen left behind a life of steady, respectable work to test a single idea most of his contemporaries dismissed as too simple to matter. He wrote it in a sentence that has outlived every fortune built and lost since. Circumstances grow out of thought, not from luck, not from birthright, from the ground of the mind itself, cultivated or neglected, one repeated thought at a time. To most, this sounds too plain to be true. Surely poverty is more complicated than a habit of mind. And yet look closely at the people around you. Some move through hardship and rebuild without bitterness, as though scarcity were a season rather than a sentence. Others, given every advantage, still speak the language of lack until lack arrives to meet them. The difference was never the size of their fortune. It was the seed they kept planting, season after season, without ever calling it planting. Allen did not ask his readers to believe in a mystical force outside themselves. He asked something quieter, and in some ways harder, that they take responsibility for the field they had been tending all along. Every thought repeated is a seed pressed into soil. Every soil, left untended, grows something, usually weeds, never nothing. This is not punishment, it is mechanism, as plain and impartial as the turning of a season. Here is the law as Allen understood it. The mind is a garden. It cannot remain empty. What you fail to cultivate deliberately, it will grow wild on your behalf. And the harvest you call your circumstances, your lack, your struggle, your quiet sense that there is never enough, was never imposed on you from outside. It was grown, thought by thought, inside ground you had forgotten you were responsible for. Picture that ground now, whatever condition it is in. Overgrown, perhaps, neglected for years. But soil does not remember its past. It answers only to what is placed in it next. The same ground that has carried nothing but scarcity for a decade will, without protest, grow abundance the day someone finally plants it there on purpose. As you move into Chapter 1, Thought is the seed, you will see exactly how this quiet mechanism has been shaping every circumstance of your life, season after season, without your notice. And once you understand it, lack will never again feel like something that happened to you. You will know, from this point forward, that you were never without a harvest. You were only ever without a gardener. Chapter 1. Thought is the seed. Before he became known for a single slim volume that would outlast the century, James Allen spent years in ordinary employment, the kind of steady, unremarkable work that fills most lives without ever asking them to examine themselves. He was a private secretary, then worked in manufacturing, moving through the same corridors of duty and routine that occupied nearly everyone he knew. Nothing in his early circumstances suggested a man on the verge of discovering a law that would quietly reorganize how thousands of people understood their own lives. What changed was not his position, it was his attention. Somewhere in the daily repetition of that working life, Allen began to notice something most people walk past without seeing. That the men and women around him, doing similar work under similar conditions, were not experiencing similar lives. Some carried their circumstances with a kind of ease, treating setbacks as temporary weather. Others, in nearly identical positions, seemed permanently weighed down, certain that their situation was fixed, external, someone else's doing. Same offices, same wages, same city, entirely different inner worlds. He began to ask the question few people think to ask about their own condition. Not, "What is happening to me?" but, "What have I been thinking so consistently that this is what keeps happening?" It was a small shift in the direction of inquiry, but it changed everything that followed. Alan eventually left the security of steady employment to devote himself to writing and reflection, a decision that alarmed people who measured a man's soundness by the stability of his income. He was, in effect, testing his own thesis with his own life. If thought truly shaped circumstance, then a life reorganized around disciplined thought should reorganize its circumstances in turn. The sentence he arrived at, and the one this teaching stands on, is simple enough to miss its own weight. Thought is the seed, and circumstance is the harvest. Not metaphorically, in the loose way people use garden imagery to decorate an idea. He meant it as a mechanism, as reliable as the fact that a fig tree does not produce thistles. Whatever is planted, repeated, tended in the mind, will, in its own season, appear in the outer conditions of a life. Not instantly, not always recognizably, but inevitably. This is worth sitting with because it reframes something most people never question: the assumption that circumstance comes first and thought merely reacts to it. We tend to believe we think about our lack because we are lacking, that the thought is a response to the fact. Alan inverted this entirely. The fact, he argued, is a response to the thought. Poverty is not what produces poor thinking. Poor thinking, repeated long enough, produces poverty. The order everyone assumes is backwards. Consider how this plays out in a single, ordinary day. A person wakes and, before fully conscious, reaches for a familiar thought. I can't get ahead. Nothing works out for me. The thought is old, worn smooth from use, barely noticed as it passes. But it is not neutral. It is a seed pressed into the soil of the day ahead, and it will not lie dormant. It will shape which opportunities are noticed and which are dismissed before they are even considered. It will shape the tone of a conversation, the willingness to ask, the readiness to receive. By evening, the day will have produced evidence, a missed chance, a closed door, a flat refusal. And the thought will feel confirmed rather than causal. See, the mind says, I told you. It never occurs to the thinker that the seed and the harvest were the same event, separated only by a few hours. Alan was not interested in blame. He was interested in mechanism, the way a farmer is interested in mechanism rather than moral judgment when explaining why one field yields grain and another yields weeds. No field is punished for growing weeds. It simply grew what was placed in it, or what was allowed to take root in the absence of anything else. The same is true of a mind left to its habitual thought without examination. It is not malfunctioning when it produces a lack. It is functioning exactly as designed, faithfully converting repeated thought into corresponding circumstance. This is, in one sense, an uncomfortable law, because it removes the comfort of blaming the field for its own weather. But it is also, in a more lasting sense, the only law that offers genuine ground for change. A field that produces weeds through neglect can produce grain through cultivation. Nothing about the soil itself needs to change, only what is planted in it, deliberately, and tended long enough to take root. In the next chapter, we will look more closely at what happens to a mind left untended, not as abstraction, but as a specific, observable process. The quiet way neglect becomes habit, and habit becomes what a person mistakes for their fixed nature. Because before we can plant anything new, we have to understand exactly what has been growing wild in that soil all along, and why it has felt for so long like something other than a choice. Chapter 2. The Untended Ground. Picture a garden left alone for a single season. No hand has touched it. No one has walked its rows in months. At first, from a distance, it might look merely quiet, dormant, resting, waiting for someone to return, but walk closer, and the truth becomes visible in the details. Along the borders where cultivated plants once stood in orderly lines, something else has taken hold. Thin, wiry stems push up through the cracks in the old paths. Vines creep sideways rather than up, finding whatever structure they can use, indifferent to whether it was built for them. Where there was once a clear border between path and bed, there is now only a single, tangled mass, and the eye can no longer tell where cultivation ended and neglect began. This is not a garden doing nothing. This is a garden working exactly as hard as it ever did, producing exactly as much as it ever did, only now producing weeds instead of grain, without asking anyone's permission, without needing anyone's effort. Soil does not rest. It does not wait politely for a gardener to return before deciding what to do with itself. Left alone, it will still receive rain, still receive sun, still convert whatever seed happens to land on it, blown in on the wind, dropped by passing birds, buried years earlier and merely waiting for the right season to surface. Nothing about neglect produces emptiness. It only produces a different harvest, one nobody chose and everybody eventually has to deal with. This is the exact condition of a mind that has never been examined. It is tempting to imagine that a mind left untended simply sits in neutral, waiting for someone to decide what to think. This is not how it functions, and it is not how Alan described it. A mind, like soil, does not pause in the absence of deliberate cultivation. It keeps producing thought, continuously, and where no discipline directs that production, the seeds that take root are rarely the ones anyone would have chosen on purpose. They are the seeds already present in the air of a life, inherited fears, overheard opinions, half-remembered failures, the offhand remark of a parent or a teacher, repeated so many times internally that its origin is long forgotten. None of it was planted with intention. All of it grew anyway. This is why lack so often feels less like a belief and more like a fact of nature to the person experiencing it. No one remembers choosing to think, "There's never enough," the way one remembers choosing a meal or a career. The thought simply appeared early and was watered by repetition until its roots ran deeper than memory. By the time it is fully grown, it no longer feels like something that was planted at all. It feels like the shape of the ground itself. Walk further into that neglected garden and something else becomes visible, something easy to miss on a first glance. The weeds are not evenly distributed by accident. They cluster most thickly exactly where the soil was once richest. The beds that were cultivated longest, that held the deepest, most fertile ground, are often the ones now most overrun, because fertile soil grows whatever is placed in it with the same generosity, favoring nothing, judging nothing. It does not distinguish between a seed of wheat and a seed of thistle. It simply does its work. This is sobering to consider because it means the very mind capable of the richest thought, the sharpest reasoning, the deepest feeling, the most vivid imagination, is exactly as capable of growing a magnificent harvest of scarcity, if that is what continues, unexamined, to be planted in it. There is a particular kind of person who insists their circumstances have nothing to do with their thinking, who points to the garden and says, "Look how wild it has become. This proves the ground is bad. Nothing good could ever grow here." Alan would have said the opposite is true. A garden capable of producing such a dense, vigorous tangle of weeds is a garden of considerable fertility. The problem was never the ground. The problem was the absence of a gardener willing to decide, deliberately and repeatedly, what belonged there instead. This is where most people stop, discouraged by the size of the tangle, mistaking density of neglect for permanence of condition. But no overgrowth, however thick, changes what the soil beneath it is capable of. Weeds do not exhaust the ground. They simply occupy it until something else is planted with enough persistence to compete for the same space, the same light, the same rain. In the next chapter, we will look directly at how deeply this occupied ground can be mistaken for one's actual nature. How a person comes to believe, with complete sincerity, that scarcity is simply who they are, rather than what they have, for years allowed to grow unchallenged in the one place they were always free to cultivate. Chapter 3. Circumstance is not accident. There is a sentence Alan wrote that people tend to read quickly, nod at, and move past, without letting it land with its full weight. He said, "Circumstances grow out of thought." 4 words carrying the entire architecture of this teaching, and yet so plainly stated that the mind slides right over them, looking for something more elaborate to hold on to. Sit with just the verb he chose. Not circumstances follow thought. Not circumstances are influenced by thought, as if thought were one variable among many, competing with luck, timing, and other people's decisions. He wrote to grow out of. The relationship he is describing is not a correlation, it is a generation. The way a stalk grows out of a seed, carrying the seed's nature forward into a new form, is unable to produce anything the seed did not already contain. This has a direct and uncomfortable implication. If circumstance grows out of thought, the way a plant grows out of a seed, then no circumstance can be understood as accidental, in the sense of being disconnected from its origin. A weed is never an accident to the seed that produced it. It is the seed's exact, faithful expression. The word accident is really just a name we give to a cause we have lost track of, not evidence that no cause exists, only evidence that the connection between seed and harvest has drifted out of view, usually because so much time passed between the planting and the growing that no one thought to connect the two. Trace this forward through an ordinary life. A thought of unworthiness, planted early, rarely produces its harvest the same week. It might take years, through hesitations never quite explained, opportunities quietly declined before they were even fully considered, a persistent instinct to ask for less than what was offered. None of these moments feels, at the time, like the consequence of a single old thought. Each one feels like its own isolated event, its own bad luck, its own unrelated circumstance. Only looking back across the whole field does the pattern surface. The same seed, sown once, harvested 100 times in 100 different disguises. This is why circumstance so rarely announces its origin. A person facing a stalled career, a chronic shortage of money, a relationship that repeats the same disappointment under different names, will search everywhere for the cause, except the one place Alan insisted it could always be found. They will examine the economy, the industry, the other person's failings, and the unfairness of timing. All of these may carry some truth, but underneath the outer explanation, if the pattern is old enough and persistent enough, there is almost always a seed that was planted long before any of these outer conditions existed to receive the blame. Consider the reverse case as well, because it clarifies the law rather than sentimentalizes it. 2 people can inherit strikingly similar disadvantages, the same lack of early opportunity, the same thin resources, the same discouraging environment, and produce entirely different harvests over the following decades. This is not because one person worked harder in the narrow sense of labor. It is because one of them, consciously or not, stopped renewing the seed of limitation somewhere along the way, and began, however imperfectly, planting something else. The outer disadvantage did not vanish. It simply stopped being the only thing growing in that ground. This is the precise place where the belief in lack as a condition collapses under its own weight. A condition, by definition, is something imposed from outside, indifferent to the will of the one experiencing it. Weather, geography, the accident of birth. A harvest is something else entirely. It responds, faithfully and without exception, to what continues to be planted in it, regardless of how long ago the planting began or how invisible the connection has become. Alan was not asking anyone to deny the reality of hardship. He was asking them to stop mistaking the visible hardship for the invisible cause, and to notice that the two, however disconnected they appear, are never actually separate. None of this requires belief in anything mystical. It requires only patience enough to trace a pattern across years instead of days, and honesty enough to ask, of any recurring circumstance, not, "Why is this happening to me?" but, "What have I been planting, faithfully enough and long enough, that this keeps happening through me?" In the next chapter, we will look at exactly how a single planted thought stops feeling like a thought at all, how repetition disguises a seed as a fact until the very idea that it could have been planted differently starts to feel implausible, even offensive to the person who has lived inside its harvest the longest. Chapter 4. The Habit Wearing the Mask of Fate. The most convincing lies are rarely the dramatic ones. They are the quiet ones, repeated so often and so early that they stop announcing themselves as claims at all. A dramatic lie invites scrutiny. A quiet one, repeated for years without contradiction, simply becomes the furniture of a person's inner life. So familiar it is no longer inspected, only lived inside. This is the exact mechanism by which a planted thought stops feeling like a thought and starts feeling like fate. Consider how a belief actually enters a life. It rarely arrives with evidence attached. A child overhears a parent say, offhand and half-joking, "We're just not the kind of people who get lucky." No study accompanies the remark, no argument is made. It is simply said, in passing, the way the weather is mentioned. And because it arrives without the trappings of an argument, it is never evaluated the way an argument would be. It slips past the part of the mind that questions and lodges directly in the part that assumes. Years later, that same person may hold sophisticated opinions on economics, politics, philosophy, able to interrogate any claim presented to them directly. And yet this one sentence, absorbed before they had the tools to question anything, remains untouched, because it was never encountered as a claim in the first place. It was encountered as background. This is the danger Alan pointed to that most self-improvement of his era, and of ours, entirely misses. People search for the belief holding them back the way they might search for a misplaced object, expecting it to look foreign, to announce itself as false the moment it is found. But the beliefs doing the most damage rarely look false. They look like plain observation. Money is hard to come by. People like us don't get those opportunities. "I've just never been lucky with this." Said in the tone of someone reporting weather, not someone stating a position. And a report cannot be argued with the way a position can, because a report simply describes what is, while a position asserts what someone believes to be true. The first draws no objection, the second, at least, invites one. Repetition is what performs this transformation, and it performs it with a kind of mechanical patience that has nothing to do with whether the thought was ever true. Say something once, and it remains an opinion, exposed, examinable. Say it, or hear it, or silently rehearse it 10,000 times across 2 decades, and something changes in its texture. It does not become truer, it becomes more familiar, and the mind consistently mistakes the two. Familiarity feels like evidence. The longer a thought has stood unchallenged in a person's inner landscape, the more the mind treats its mere presence as a form of proof, entirely apart from whether anything has actually been demonstrated. This is why Alan insisted that the work of examining one's thought could not be done once, in a single moment of insight, and considered finished. A weed pulled once does not guarantee the ground will not produce another in its place next season, drawing on roots that were never fully removed, only cut back at the surface. The old thought, "There's never enough," may be recognized clearly in a single afternoon of honest reflection, seen for what it is, named, even temporarily set aside. And yet, without sustained attention, it will return within days, not because the insight was false, but because insight alone does not uproot a habit that took years to establish. Only repetition can undo what repetition built. There is no shortcut around this, however much people search for one. There is a particular resistance that appears at exactly this point in the process, worth naming honestly, because so many stop here without recognizing why. When a belief this old is finally challenged directly, when someone suggests that "we're just not the kind of people who get lucky," might not be a fact at all, but a sentence repeated long enough to feel like one, the reaction is rarely gratitude. It is often something closer to offense. The old belief has stood in for identity for so long that questioning it can feel like an attack on the self rather than an invitation to freedom. This is the mask fully formed, a habit of thought so thoroughly disguised as fate that even the suggestion of its removal feels, briefly, like a threat. Alan did not treat this resistance as failure. He treated it as evidence of exactly how deep the roots had grown, and therefore exactly how long the tending would need to continue. The mask does not come off in a single motion. It loosens gradually, every time a person catches the old sentence mid-thought and simply declines to repeat it once more. Not with force, not with dramatic declaration, but with the same quiet patience the original habit was built from. In the next chapter, we turn from what has been growing without direction to the deliberate alternative. What it actually means to take up the work of a gardener rather than remain a bystander in one's own field, and why Alan considered this shift, from passive inheritor of thought to deliberate cultivator of it, the entire hinge on which a changed life turns. Chapter 5. Purpose as the gardener's hand. There are two ways to relate to a field, and Alan returned to this distinction often enough that it deserves to be drawn out in full, because the difference between them is not a difference of effort, it is a difference of posture. The first is the posture of the wanderer who happens to cross a field on the way to somewhere else. The wanderer notices the ground, perhaps admires or pities it, depending on what is growing there, and continues walking. Whatever takes root behind him is none of his concern, because he never claimed the field as his responsibility in the first place. He did not plant the weeds, and so, in his own mind, he bears no relation to them. He is a visitor to his own life, watching its weather with a kind of detached commentary, as if circumstance was simply something happening nearby rather than something he had any hand in producing. The second is the posture of the gardener. The gardener does not merely pass through the field, the gardener claims it, walks its rows deliberately, and treats whatever grows there, intended or not, as a direct consequence of attention given or withheld. This is not a difference in how much either person cares about outcomes. The wanderer may care a great deal, may wish fervently for a different harvest. The difference is that the gardener has accepted a specific kind of authority the wanderer has quietly declined. The authority and the corresponding responsibility of deciding what gets planted, and then tending that decision long enough for it to take root. Alan called the tool of this authority a purpose. Not ambition in the restless, striving sense the word often carries, and not a vague wish held loosely enough to abandon at the first disappointment. Purpose, in his understanding, is something closer to what a gardener means by a planting plan, a decision made in advance, before the season begins, about exactly what this ground will be asked to produce, followed by the discipline to keep tending that decision through weather that has nothing to do with how the planter feels on any given day. This is worth contrasting directly with what fills a field left to the wanderer's posture. The wanderer's mind is never actually empty. No field is. It simply receives whatever drifts into it, a worry inherited from childhood, an offhand fear absorbed from a stranger's comment, the residue of yesterday's disappointment replanting itself out of habit rather than decision. None of this required intention. All of it grew anyway, precisely because no counter-decision was ever made to occupy the same ground. Purpose does not need to fight this drifting growth directly, the way one might pull weeds by hand, one at a time, in endless labor. It crowds it out, the way a deliberately planted crop, tended consistently, gradually starves out whatever volunteer growth would otherwise have taken the same light and the same water. There is a specific quality Alan attributed to purpose that separates it from a mere wish, and it is worth naming precisely because most people mistake one for the other and wonder why nothing changes. A wish is planted once, admired, and then left to compete against years of established growth without reinforcement. A single seed dropped into ground already dense with older roots, expected somehow to outcompete them through sheer merit alone. Purpose, as Alan meant it, is planted and then returned to, daily, the way an actual gardener does not sow a field in spring and disappear until harvest, but walks it repeatedly, noticing what threatens the young growth and removing it before it can establish itself. This return is not glamorous. It rarely feels, on any single day, like it is producing anything at all. This is precisely why the wanderer's posture is so much more common. It demands nothing daily, while the gardener's posture demands attention on days when nothing visible has changed and no reward is yet in sight. What purpose changes, first and most immediately, is not the outer circumstance. That comes later and slower than most people are willing to wait for. What it changes first is the relationship between the person and the field itself. The wanderer, encountering scarcity, experiences it as weather, something arriving from outside, to be endured or complained about, entirely beyond influence. The gardener, encountering the same scarcity, experiences it as a report on last season's planting, unwelcome perhaps, but legible, and therefore not beyond the reach of the next decision. This shift alone, before a single new seed has fully grown, changes what scarcity means to the person living inside it. It stops being a verdict and becomes, instead, simply the most recent entry in a ledger that is still being written. This is the hinge Alan considered central to everything that follows, not a technique for thinking positively in the face of hardship, which so often amounts to little more than the wanderer's posture dressed in more optimistic language. Something closer to a change of office, laying down the role of passenger in one's own field and taking up, deliberately and without ceremony, the ordinary, repeated work of the one who decides what gets planted here from now on. In the next chapter, we move from posture into practice, the specific, repeated disciplines Alan described as the actual work of tending thought, so that purpose does not remain an abstraction admired from a distance, but becomes something done, daily, with the same plainness as any other form of labor worth doing well. Chapter 6. What you water grows. There is a habit worth building before any other, and it begins not with changing what you think, but with noticing what you are already thinking, without judgment, the way a gardener walks a field at dawn, simply to see what is there before deciding what to do about it. Alan called this self-examination, and he meant something more precise than the loose, occasional self-reflection most people practice when a crisis forces the question. He meant a regular, almost clerical habit of attention, pausing, at intervals through an ordinary day, to ask plainly, "What have I been thinking for the last hour without deciding to?" Not in a spirit of alarm, and not in a spirit of self-criticism, both of which tend to end the exercise before it has properly begun. Simply as observation, the same way a gardener notes which rows have thinned without yet asking why. Most people never perform this check, and so they remain strangers to their own most repeated thoughts, the way a person can live beside a constant, low sound for so long they stop hearing it entirely. The thought, "there's never enough," may cross a mind 40 times in a single day, so worn and familiar that it produces no sensation at all, no flicker of recognition. Self-examination is simply the practice of interrupting that invisibility often enough to see the pattern clearly. Not once, in a single dramatic afternoon of insight, but repeatedly, the way any observation becomes reliable only through repetition. Once a thought has been seen this clearly, a second discipline becomes possible, one Alan treated as inseparable from the first. He called it, in the plain language of his era, right thinking. Not positive thinking in the sense of forced cheerfulness laid over an unexamined field, but the deliberate act of replacing a specific old sentence with a specific new one, chosen in advance rather than improvised in the moment of noticing. This distinction matters more than it first appears. A person who notices the thought, "I can't afford this," and simply tries to feel better in the moment, is still standing in the same field, still working without a plan. A person who has already decided, ahead of time, that this old sentence will be met with a specific replacement, "I am capable of creating what I need," is doing something closer to what Alan meant by disciplined cultivation. The replacement is not a denial that hardship exists. It is a refusal to let the old sentence plant itself again, unchallenged, in ground that has already carried it long enough. This single practice, repeated with enough consistency, does something that a single burst of positive feeling cannot. It changes which thought arrives first, by habit, the next time the same circumstance appears. This is worth stating plainly, because it is the entire mechanism at work beneath every gardening metaphor in this teaching. The mind, like soil, favors whatever has been planted most recently and most often. A single act of right thinking, performed once, competes weakly against years of the old habit. The same act, performed daily for months, gradually becomes the thought that arrives first, simply because it has now been watered more than its rival. The third discipline is the one most often skipped, because it asks something of the body and the day, not merely of private thought. Alan insisted that inner cultivation without corresponding outer action produces nothing lasting, that a purpose held only in the mind, never expressed through the ordinary decisions of a day, remains a seed never actually pressed into soil. This does not mean frantic effort, the kind of striving Alan associated with the very anxiety he was trying to dissolve. It means small, consistent, aligned action. The phone call not postponed another day, the honest conversation finally had, the modest step taken toward the purpose decided upon, even when no immediate reward is visible. Action of this kind is not what earns the harvest, in Alan's understanding. It is what presses the seed firmly enough into the ground that wind and neglect cannot simply carry it away before it roots. Together, these three, plain observation of what is already growing, deliberate replacement of the old with the specifically chosen new, and small, aligned action that gives the new thought somewhere to stand, form the entire practical discipline Alan offered. Nothing here is dramatic. Nothing here promises a single afternoon's transformation. This is, deliberately, the plainness of actual gardening rather than the spectacle so often associated with sudden change. Unremarkable, repeated, easy to underestimate on any single day, and yet, across a season tended consistently, impossible to argue with. What you water, Alan would say, grows. Not what you wish for once and forget, not what you notice and then abandon at the first sign that nothing has changed yet. Only what continues, day after unremarkable day, to receive your attention. This is not a law that rewards intensity. It rewards persistence, offered plainly, to ground that was never as fixed as it appeared. In the next chapter, we turn to what begins to appear in a life tended this way over time. Not sudden abundance, but a particular quality of composure that Alan considered the surest evidence that the work was genuinely underway, long before the outer harvest had fully arrived. Chapter 7. Serenity is the proof, not the reward. There is a mistake worth naming before it takes hold, because it quietly undoes the discipline just described if left unexamined. It is the assumption that the evidence of changed thought will appear first, and most convincingly, in changed circumstance. That the surest sign the work is genuinely underway will be a number in a bank account, an opportunity finally arriving, a door that was closed now standing open. Alan placed the evidence somewhere else entirely, somewhere most people overlook because it offers no external proof to point to, nothing that can be shown to another person as confirmation. He placed it in composure. Watch two people move through an identical piece of hardship, the same unexpected expense, the same setback at work, the same uncertain week. One meets it with the old, familiar tightening, a spike of dread, a rehearsal of every reason things always go this way, a private conviction that this confirms what was always suspected about how life treats someone like them. The other meets the same hardship, and something in their bearing does not match the size of the event. Not indifference. Alan was careful to distinguish composure from mere detachment, which is simply the wanderer's posture wearing a calmer face. Something closer to steadiness. An inconvenience is registered as an inconvenience, addressed as a practical matter, and released, without being asked to carry the additional weight of proving anything about the future. This second response is not, Alan insisted, a personality trait some people are simply born with, while others are not. It is a harvest, exactly like any other, grown from thought cultivated long enough to produce a different instinctive reaction to the same class of event. The person who meets hardship with steadiness is not thinking harder in the moment of crisis than the person who meets it with dread. They are drawing on ground already prepared, months or years earlier, through the plain, repeated discipline described in the previous chapter. The composure is not an effort applied in the moment. It is the visible surface of roots that goes back much further than the immediate event. This is why Alan treated serenity as proof rather than a reward. A reward arrives after the labor is finished, separate from it, a payment for work concluded. Proof is different. Proof is evidence, gathered along the way, that the work is real and already functioning, even before its fullest harvest has appeared above ground. A gardener does not wait until the final crop is standing tall to know whether the soil has been properly tended. The gardener reads the health of the young shoots weeks earlier, their color, their steadiness in the wind, their resistance to the first minor pests that would have overwhelmed weaker growth. Composure, in a person's inner life, functions exactly this way. It is the young shoot, not the final crop, and it appears well before the outer circumstances have caught up to the inner change. This matters enormously for anyone in the early, unglamorous middle of this discipline, precisely the stage where discouragement most often ends the effort. The outer field has not yet visibly changed. The bank account looks the same. The opportunity has not yet arrived. It is tempting at this stage to conclude that nothing is working, that the daily practice of observation and replacement and small aligned action has produced no evidence of anything. Alan would have asked a different, more precise question. Has the same class of hardship, met 3 months ago with dread, begun to be met now with anything closer to steadiness? If so, the field is not barren. It is doing exactly what tended ground does before a harvest becomes visible. Building root structure that cannot yet be seen from above the surface, but that will, in time, be exactly what allows the visible crop to stand. There is a further quality to this composure worth distinguishing carefully, because it separates Alan's teaching from a shallower imitation of it. The serenity he described is not the absence of desire for a better circumstance, nor a resigned acceptance that pretends indifference to outcome. It is entirely compatible with continuing to plant, continuing to tend, continuing to want the harvest to arrive. What it removes is not the wanting, but the frantic quality that so often accompanies unmet want. The the sense that each day without visible progress is evidence against the entire effort, rather than simply another ordinary day of tending that has not yet reached its season. This is, in the end, a quieter form of confidence than the word usually suggests. Not the confidence of someone certain of a specific outcome by a specific date, which is really just anxiety wearing a more presentable name. Something closer to the confidence of a gardener in early spring, walking rows that show no fruit yet, entirely undisturbed by their bareness, because the gardener understands what bare ground, tended consistently, is already, quietly, in the process of becoming. In the final chapter before the epilogue, we turn to the harvest itself, not as a future event still to be waited for, but as something that becomes visible, on close inspection, to have already been arriving in smaller forms all along, unnoticed simply because no one had been taught to recognize a harvest that arrives gradually rather than all at once. Chapter 8. The Harvest You Didn't Notice. Planting. Stop for a moment and look backward instead of forward. Not at the field ahead, still waiting for the deliberate planting described in the last several chapters. Look instead at the field behind you, the one already standing, fully grown, made up of everything currently true about your life. The circumstances you did not choose in any single dramatic moment, but that arrived, gradually, as the visible result of thought held for years before you began examining any of it. Most people never perform this backward look with any real honesty because it is uncomfortable in a way the forward-looking version of this work is not. It is one thing to plant something new with hope attached. It is another to walk back through an existing field and recognize plainly which of its rows you tended without knowing you were tending them. Do this now, briefly, before moving further. Consider one circumstance in your life you have long treated as simply given, a persistent tightness around money, a pattern in how opportunity has or has not arrived, a quiet, background conviction about what you are or are not permitted to have. Trace it backward, not searching for someone to blame, but searching, the way Alan described, for the seed. Somewhere behind that circumstance, if the pattern is old enough, there is very likely a sentence, heard once, repeated many times since, so early and so quietly absorbed that it never had the chance to be evaluated before it was accepted. This is not an exercise in guilt. It is simply the recognition that the field standing behind you was never actually empty ground, waiting passively for fate to decide its contents. It was cultivated, thought, by someone who did not yet know cultivation was underway. That someone was you. This recognition, uncomfortable as it first appears, is the exact hinge on which the entire discipline turns from theory into lived fact. Because if the field behind you is proof of the mechanism, proof that thought, held long enough, becomes circumstance without exception, then the field ahead of you is no longer a hopeful guess about whether this teaching might work. It is simply the next season of a process already demonstrated, in your own life, by everything currently surrounding you. The harvest already standing is the evidence, not the promise of a future harvest. The evidence that the law was operating the entire time, whether or not anyone was watching for it. There is a second, quieter observation available in this backward look, and it is easy to miss on a first pass. Not everything in the field behind you is a weed. Look closely enough, and there is very likely already some grain standing among the tangle. A relationship that has remained steady despite hardship. A skill built patiently over years without fanfare. A quiet resilience you have relied on more than once without naming it as a harvest at all. These too were planted, thought by thought, though far less deliberately noticed than the difficulties usually are. This matters because it demonstrates something the earlier chapters could only describe in principle, that the same mind capable of growing a decade of scarcity through unexamined repetition is equally capable of growing something worth keeping, and in fact has already done so, more than once, without needing to be told how. This is the quiet reversal Alan was pointing toward all along, though he rarely stated it as bluntly as this. The harvest you are waiting for, somewhere in an imagined future, has actually already begun. Not the specific outer form of it, not the number in the account, not the door not yet opened. But the mechanism producing it has been running the entire length of this teaching, from the first chapter's recognition that thought is the seed, through the daily discipline of the 6th chapter, through the steadiness described in the 7th. Every day this discipline has been practiced, even imperfectly, even with lapses back into old habit. Something has been growing, quietly, beneath ground that gives no outer sign until it is ready to break the surface, entirely on its own schedule, indifferent to how closely it was being watched. This is why patience in this teaching is not passive waiting. It is closer to what a gardener means by patience, full attention and full labor, applied consistently, without the anxious daily checking that mistakes invisible growth for absent growth. The seed beneath soil is doing the most important work of its entire life in the weeks when nothing at all is visible above ground. To dig it up in that period, out of impatience, to check whether the work is real, is the single surest way to kill it before it has the chance to prove itself. What remains then is not a technique to master or a single insight to hold on to, but a posture to keep returning to, day after unremarkable day, for exactly as long as it takes ground long neglected to answer to a hand finally willing to tend it. In the epilogue, we return to where this teaching began, the recognition that lack was never handed to you, and neither in the end is abundance. Both are grown, and the hand doing the growing was, from the very first chapter, always yours to use. Epilogue. You were always the gardener. There is no dramatic ending to this kind of work, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. No single sentence, however clearly understood, transforms a field overnight. What changes, gradually and then permanently, is simply the relationship between a person and the ground they had until now mistaken for something fixed. Return, one last time, to where this began. A belief so old it wore the mask of fact, that lack is a condition, handed down, endured, argued with, but never actually questioned at its root. We have spent this hour taking that mask off, slowly, the way Alan himself took it off, not through a single revelation, but through the plain, repeated recognition that circumstance grows out of thought, that thought left untended grows wild on its own terms, and that the ground responsible for both was never anywhere outside the one now listening. This is not a comfortable place to end, and it was never meant to be. It is far more comfortable to close a teaching like this with a promise, a guarantee of what will bloom and when, if only the listener does exactly as instructed. Alan offered no such guarantee, and neither can this. What he offered instead was something plainer and, in the long run, more durable. The certainty that the ground responds to what is placed in it, faithfully, without exception, regardless of how long the neglect that came before it lasted. So the field ahead of you now is simply that, a field. Not a verdict already rendered, not a fate already sealed by years of unexamined thought. Whatever has grown there until this hour was real, and its harvest was real, but soil does not remember its past. It only answers to what is placed in it next. This is the entire quiet promise of this teaching, stripped of anything that might have made it sound more dramatic than it actually is. Nothing about the ground itself needs to be exceptional. It only needs tending, plainly and repeated, by someone finally willing to claim the role. You were told, somewhere early, that lack was a condition, that the field was simply the field, and you were only ever a visitor passing through it, watching its weather from a distance. This was never true, though it may have felt true for longer than you can easily measure. You were, from the very first thought you ever repeated without noticing, already the one holding the seed, already the one deciding, by attention given or withheld, what this ground would be asked to produce next. Nothing about that has changed by the end of this hour. What has changed, if this teaching has done its quiet work, is simply that you know it now. And knowing it, plainly and without ceremony, is the only beginning this kind of work has ever required. The field is still there, so is the seed. So, and this was always the point, is the hand.